While more recent media within Star Wars has certainly featured LGBTQ characters in more prominent roles, including Vel Sartha in Cinta Kaz and Andor, this kind of representation, while not always as common, did factor into Legends, and today we're going to talk about some of the either biggest examples of LGBTQ characters, or just references which existed throughout Legends media. In the 2003 game Knights of the Old Republic, the fallen Jedi turned party member Juhani became not just one of the first lesbian characters in a Star Wars game, but one of the first lesbian characters in a video game more generally. She was originally intended to be a romance option solely for female player characters, although some scripting bugs meant it was not fully turned off for male player characters, and the Star Wars databank inaccurately stated that the romance line with Juhani was available fully for players of either selectable gender. David Gaider, a writer who worked on the game at BioWare and who later became the lead writer on Dragon Age, wrote about his experience in an article for Polygon, where he describes himself as a game designer who also happens to be gay, and he references the inclusion of Juhani here, saying, quote, "The first time it came up was on Knights of the Old Republic with Juhani, and that wasn't my doing. I was, in fact, completely startled by the idea that not only was this a thing that could happen, the inclusion of a gay character, but more so that my fellow developers, the vast majority of whom are straight men, would not only be okay with it, but actually want to include it. I'm not sure I can express how that made me feel. I guess I'd always assumed they simply wouldn't, despite these being a group of liberal-minded and compassionate people. I thought the audience out there just wouldn't accept it, and that we would never do anything to rock the boat. I underestimated them." A second student on Dantooine named Balea gets very upset with you if you don't save Juhani, and references Knights Under the Stars together. The intent here was that they were both in a romantic relationship. KOTOR 2 largely didn't touch on romance options aside from Atton being kind of a creep sometimes, but in the Knights of the Old Republic MMO, there are several characters the player is able to romance of the same gender as their own character. One such example is Lemda of Vesta, a bi character who, going by the guide made by YouTuber and the Old Republic expert Star Wars Terista, seems to be primarily attracted not based on gender, but on factional loyalties. In written material, so short stories and novels, there was a bit more of a lead up towards the first openly gay couple playing any significant role. But there were at least minor allusions to same-sex attraction or couples, and there were also characters who were sometimes read as being gay, despite not having official confirmation within the media itself. Ferris Olin in The Last of the Jedi young adult novels, for example, was widely speculated to have been intended to be read as gay, and in a romantic relationship with another character in the books, Rowan Lance. When asked about this in 2015, 10 years after the publication of the books, Jude Watson confirmed that it had in fact been her intent. She had pictured them essentially as a married couple, and thought they would like this video and subscribe for more. Unfortunately, the response to having characters like Juhani who were a bit more openly gay in the media was not altogether positive. And this kind of response to gay representation in media probably informed how willing authors and publishers were to have openly gay characters. But by the time of this confirmation of Ferris and Rowan in 2015, Star Wars Legends had finished publication. An openly gay couple was introduced only a couple years after Ferris and Rowan. This came in 2008's Legacy of the Force Revelation by Karen Travis. Goran Bevan, basically Boba Fett's right-hand man and the person actually responsible for running the Mandalorians while Boba was being bad at his job, was revealed to be gay and married to his partner Medrit Vassor. Both characters had been introduced by Travis 2 years earlier in Boba Fett: A Practical Man, but Vassor didn't have a specified gender until Revelation. This is obviously being said with the benefit of hindsight and having been introduced to Medrit and Bevan as an openly gay couple in Legacy of the Force, but when I look back through A Practical Man, it feels pretty intentional that a pronoun is never used with reference to Medrit. He's mentioned several times without the relatively short story, and every time he's referred to directly by name, with no pronouns being referenced whatsoever. A handful of trans and non-binary characters have been introduced since the Canon reboot, but Legends doesn't have any specific openly trans characters. But that being said, Legends isn't devoid of references to issues in a similar ballpark of gender identity. Some species had very different ideas of gender and sex from humans, but in most cases those species are very unlike humans in other ways as well. When it comes to humans and species who are essentially humans, Boba Fett Crossfire introduces a species called the Excargans through a character named Gar. Boba, who's 10, befriends Gar, who's also 10, and asks them whether they're a boy or a girl. Gar explains that they're neither yet, and their species doesn't determine gender until they're teenagers. Contextually, this seems to be the only difference between Excargans and humans. They then also talk about how Gar struggles to befriend the other children, Because the other children expect boys to act a certain way and girls to act a certain way, and then Gar doesn't fit into either of those categories. So while it's not quite the same as an explicitly transgender or gender fluid human character as we would understand them, this seems like a pretty explicit exploration of issues of gender identity within a sci-fi lens. Boba and Gar basically decide it's not especially nice of the other children to exclude Gar because of this. Boba expresses that it's more important that he can call Gar a friend rather than a boy or a girl, and they just run off and play. And while there are no explicit trans characters in Legends, there are references to transgender individuals existing. In Coruscant Nights, Jedi Twilight, when Jax Pavin, a survivor of the Jedi Purge, is being hunted by the Empire, the Imperials are trying to figure out just how many Jaxes Pavin there are on Coruscant. The number they come up with is 582,797,754 human males named Jax Pavin on Coruscant, and they say they can rule out the female human Jax Pavins unless Jax has undergone what they call transgenerative surgery. This is a book that came out in 2008. But this shows that being trans is an accepted, perhaps even somewhat common part of galactic society, and this is even under the Empire, so I guess Nute Gunray doesn't really have as big a reason to be mad at the cis. Having gay or trans characters who are able to be openly gay or trans did become more common in the new canon. I think the Aftermath trilogy has examples of both. There's a trans clone named Sister, there are characters like Marin who have been in relationships with both men and women, and then there's God knows how many fanfics written about Sabine and Shin Hati. That's mostly going to do it for today, but I want to complain about Google for a minute before we go. Research for videos usually involves some amount of Googling around for stuff I may have missed, and oh my god are the stupid AI results Google is trying to push really bad. The amount of pure fabrications and hallucinations I saw while writing this video was pretty next level, combining characters and novels to the point that I felt like I was reading slash fiction written by a random character generator, which I guess is essentially what it is. It would just pick two characters, put them together, and say they had a romantic subplot in books that neither character was in sometimes. And I found this to be particularly important because it came a few hours after seeing a discussion somewhere else about some local municipal issues where someone was told to stop posting AI nonsense and they said they hadn't asked ChatGPT or something, they were just relaying the Google search overview. So I guess this is just a PSA to remember that Google search overviews are also just an LLM that hallucinates stuff. And to bring it back a bit to Star Wars lore, there are some lore channels who write videos heavily relying on that kind of thing, whether it's asking ChatGPT to summarize Wikipedia articles, or just taking those kind of top-level search results. So be careful with your media intake and information intake on the internet. Thank you for watching. Normally I ask for suggested topics in the comments. I don't know how much I'm going to read the comments on this one. Special thanks to Marmar for editing. Happy Pride Month.